Today is the 25th of April, 2017. I am Robert Whaley, retired historian at Ohio University, and this is a discussion with Dave DeWitt of the Athens News. And this is called Athens Speakout number 402. The topic is the sixth short review of Bernie Sanders' book called Our Revolution, A Future to Believe In, published in New York by St. Martin's Press in 2016. I am an emeritus associate professor, and Robert Whaley of Ohio University is trying to get this book review published, and that's going to be a rather difficult task. So the table of contents of Bernie's book in Part 2 lists 10 chapters which demonstrate Senator Sanders' plan to restore economic prosperity for all classes in America. Our last show, called the Fifth Short Review, discussed in detail Bernie's weakest chapter, called The Real Criminal Justice Reform. Today, we are hopefully going to reach the last chapters, Chapter 10, Corporate Media, The Threat to Our Democracy, and a short conclusion. Hopefully, this will be the last short reviews of Sanders' book. Now, getting back to Chapter 7, Bernie Sanders should have had a chapter on law rather than this week's chapter based on subjective sociology and psychological theories. Bernie's Chapter 7 rightfully condemns drug addiction of opioids and cocaine as real health problems, but he tends to downplay the enforcement of law. Senator Sanders from Vermont statistics seem to be cherry-picked and overly sympathetic to blacks convicted of a series of crimes by the local police. Professor John C. Burnham, intellectual and social historian from Ohio State University, and this historian, Robert Whaley, would agree that in the long run, prevention of drug addiction in both the black and the white communities should be a major goal of medical science. Last week, we discussed John Burnham's book called The Sixth Bad Habits: Alcoholism, Smoking, Drug Taking, Sexual Misbehavior, and Gambling and Swearing, published in 1963. Burnham is basically a historian of science, but beneath the surface, Burnham is a Puritan Christian who inherited the values of Jesus and St. Paul from his parents in the 1930s. Bernie Sanders is correct that because of lack of education, the white police are too hard on enforcing drug laws against poor blacks who consume crack cocaine. And the second point, that Bernie has too many comments about sexuality, which Trump exploited to beat all Democrats, Senator Sanders and Hillary Clinton, in the November 2016 elections. This sociological attitude may have helped Bernie get votes among the youthful voters in the 2015-2016 campaign. Youth does have a lot of petty nitpicking about crack cocaine and marijuana penalties that vary from state to state and from city to city. Bernie himself, however, in his second marriage and four children and 7 grandchildren, now has an old-fashioned stable family compared to the millennial generation and Generation X. John C. Burnham published a previous book, How Superstition Won and Science Lost, a Popular Science and Popular Health in the United States, published by New Brunswick, New Jersey, Rutgers University Press in 1987. Burnham's Bad Habits book was published in 1993. This popular book on pseudoscience, that is the 1987 book, has 6 chapters with citations from Popular Health and Popular Psychological magazines printed in both the 19th and 20th centuries. Unfortunately, today's journalists usually seek to write about amusing, amazing, sensational breakthroughs, and real science using the scientific method, who do real research in laboratory, seldom understood on TV. What the public reads or sees on television when they perceive the word science is really scientism. Real scientists like Albert Einstein and Charles Darwin work in a laboratory and spend a lifetime doing research on very narrow defined data. Therefore, the title of this book, called How Superstition Won in 1987, is Burnham's argument on how TV and newspaper reporters are looking for quick results concerning the nuclear bomb, the new patent medicines called miracle drugs. Advertisers and politicians are simply popularizing quick profits resulting from technocracy. The intellectual and social historian John Burnham used in 1987 his general study of psychology for his second book, Bad Habits, published in 1993. The public have long been exposed to advertising and propaganda to promote the excessive use of alcohol, tobacco, gambling, and casinos. Consumption of harmful drugs and sexual misbehavior have expanded since the birth of television in 1947, far beyond the 19th century novels and plays about adultery for hedonistic seeking pleasure seekers and people looking for quick fun over the long-term value of preserving health. In conclusion, Bernie Sanders, in his Part 2, Agenda for a New America, could profit from consulting these 2 books of Professor John C. Burnham. Not only is the slogan, "The War on Drugs," a metaphor, but Bernie overstates his case with the subtitle called, "We Must End War on Drugs." A cautious historian like Burnham and this review of Whaley would put the problem a little more differently. Reformers with Christian and Jewish values would suggest dropping the bold campaign, so we must end. Hopefully, Jews and Christians would avoid the traps of advertising, propaganda, which are potentially expanded on the perennial Facebook and Twitter. Bernie has a subsection in Chapter 7 called Dealing with Mental Health. This is another vote which amateur voters and most people would like to have a psychiatrist and a psychologist who administer successful mental health programs for drug and alcohol addiction rather than sending the addict to prison. But these health specialists who deal with psychiatry and psychology know from practical experience that the mental health programs have an ambiguous statistical record for cures, and they may not be very much better than the programs of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. The drug and alcohol addicted patient must want to cure himself. The origins of addiction in the first place is not well explained by patients which are trying to avoid the reality of moral and ethical conflicts between the ideal religions or philosophy and peer pressure. In conclusion, sexual misbehavior, drug-taking, gambling have all gotten worse throughout American society since President Donald J. Trump's successful victory at the polls in November 2016. Donald Trump became a hardline Puritan about alcohol consumption since his older brother died of alcoholism. But Trump became a pornographer and bragged in the 2015 campaign how many women he attempted to seduce. Back in the days of Franklin Roosevelt, his family had problems with divorce. But the teachings of the Christian religion were then still more powerful at the grassroots level, and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and their 5 children made an attempt to keep their sexual problems private. Trump won a majority of the voters among his naive who are then intoxicated by the term sexuality since the 1960s. Both John F. Kennedy and Bill and Hillary Clinton were involved in some kind of sexual scandals, which the Republican Party and the Democratic pundits have exaggerated to make money and tip the polls one way or another. Family values that sneered at by televisions in the case of George Herbert Walker Bush and Vice President Dan Quayle from Indiana. Senator George McGovern in South Dakota was a Methodist theologian and also a PhD historian who failed to unseat Nixon in 1972 in his possible war crimes in Indochina. In 1972, Nixon won a majority of the primitive, dogmatic Puritan Christian voters, mostly naive, rural, provincial generations left over from the 1950s, when the theology of the Christian churches were taken more seriously in the Midwest and the South. The urban press defending free love, sexuality, drug-taking in the New Left movement, which used the old guilt by association propaganda of Senator Joe McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover to defeat dovish senators like Eugene McCarthy in 1968 from Minnesota and George McGovern from South Dakota in 1972. The average Democratic members of Congress defended sexuality more than Republicans because of their sympathy with the excesses of the campus rebellion in the 1962-1975. Hedonistic playwrights, novelists, artists, journalists were more in tune with the New Left or the so-called Cultural Revolution than socially conservative historians and economists, and certainly more than natural scientists. American public opinion since the presidency of John F. Kennedy have been confused between the differences between private values and public values. The great American presidents, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, knew the difference between Christian morality and public opinion. Bernie Sanders has maintained his second marriage since 1988 as a stable relationship. Unfortunately, in attempting to recruit naive youth to vote for him, the senator had too much to say about sexuality and same-sex marriage on the part of millions of youth. The real Bernie Sanders has far more stable and as an ethical Jew and a married man who had a loyal second wife and 4 children and 7 grandchildren. Bernie adds a subsection in this controversial Chapter 7, Real Criminal Justice Reform. That is called Ending Private Prisons. Both Dave DeWitt and this reviewer agree 100% with Bernie's section on this problem. Ending the death penalty, on the other hand, is an attractive slogan which takes in all liberals and progressives. Dave DeWitt is absolutely opposed to all death penalties administered by the courts. However, in practice, there is also a tremendous amount of hypocrisy on this issue. American Jews from 1942 to the 80s were quite willing to administer the death penalty to former Nazis after the great powers occupied Germany in 1945. In 1969, this reviewer heard of Charles Manson and his 6 slaves of young girls who murdered the famous actress Sharon Tate in cold blood near Hollywood, California. TV news was not interested in solving the crime or exploring serious sociological data on the complex causes of crime. Psychiatrists who testify in various criminal trials are very subjective witnesses. Those defendants with money can get a lawyer or hire a psychiatrist who will give a light sentence for mental illness, and that leads to criminal acts. Question now to Dave DeWitt. Do you have any questions or comments about this these new points praised by Bernie Sanders' weak chapter, The Real Criminal Reform?
No, I think I've shared my views on most of the subjects in previous episodes, so we can just continue.
Okay, where we left off. Well, where we left off was that Bernie's next section in popular sociology is called The Impacts of Institutional and Structural Racism. In Whaley's opinion, these abstract words, institutional and structural, add nothing to the renewed name-calling by Bernie Sanders and others of masses of white people as racists. Senator Sanders is on strong grounds in quoting Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech in New York City in April 1967 to a pacifist group 1 year to the day before he was assassinated in April of 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, which is another conspiracy theory question. Bernie, who is not a lawyer, wisely refrains from making any comment on these alleged conspiracies. In Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King spoke to a group of garbage collectors who wanted to unionize. Senator Sanders and Martin Luther King underlined the reality of 2 Americas. One has the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality. The other, America, of millions, have poor diets and few material necessities. That is a quote that Sanders picks up from Martin Luther King, and I think that's right on target. Martin Luther King is a Baptist, a liberal, a pacifist, a socialist, and a married man, and said in a further speech, according to Sanders, this country has socialism for the rich and rugged individualism from the poor. Bernie cites U.S. Census Bureau statistics showing that the African American median household income in 2014 was $35,398. Unfortunately, this economic historian, Robert Whaley, thinks that this statistic was adequate for Bernie's campaign essay. However, it is now, since that time, that Trump has won the election, and that statistic seems to have very little relevance. The economic situation for most American people for the rest of this year, 2017, is predictably predictably going to get worse. Bernie does not handle the problems of inflation or the growing national debt very well. But the Republicans and Hillary Clinton as campaigners were even worse in dealing with the real problem of inflation and growing national debt. Bernie quotes the Pew Research Center to the effect that Black and Latino households have less than $350 savings. True enough. The problem is how to get Republican voters to read those serious books and journalists who write for the print press. One of the positive advantages of Bernie's sociological approach is that he does include statistics on age. TV America's youth culture downplays the importance of age. Before editing this section on reforming the broken criminal justice system, I should have consulted before reading the chapter a book by Professor Arthur Schlesinger Jr. I rediscovered this American historian, which I had myself recently overlooked. The senator from Vermont should look into one of Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s many books. It is well known that the Harvard professor has written on the problems of multicultural assimilation. I hope we discuss Schlesinger's book next month when we might explore Bernie Sanders' section, Chapter 8, on immigration. By that time, we will have more information about Donald Trump. Donald F. Trump will have to face hostile questions on immigration issues. As this discussion, Chapter 7, reforming Chapter 7 ends, and are we ready now to go to Chapter 10?
I think we are.
Okay. I guess I'm stalling for too much time. Chapter 10, the corporate media and the threat of our democracy. Bernie begins his summary by quoting well-known journalist by name, Arthur J. Liebling, who wrote, "Freedom of the press is only guaranteed to those who own one. The power of the press is a direct threat to American democracy." Robert Whaley disagrees with Vermont Sanders by calling the metropolitan newspapers mainstream media. The cliche lumps together, 1, big newspapers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, and papers from other big cities. 2, the major TV networks, ABC, CBS, ABC, C-SPAN, and Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And 3, cable TV, multiple cable channels. Yet most viewers who are interested in so-called news only watch about 15 to 20 minutes a day. Number 4, cyberspace, such as Twitter and Facebook, exploited by Donald Trump in the 2016 election to fool the great majority of American voters with no more than a few high school educational information. Senator Sanders writes that he joined with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat of Rhode Island, to fight back against the media. Bernie did get some coverage on Meet the Press with George Stephanopoulos, State of the Union, Face the Nation, and Fox News Sunday multiple times. At bottom, the mass media spent a minimum amount of time covering this Jewish socialist outsider. I voted for Sanders in the primary and gave him 2 $50 donations because I preferred an honest Jew over many crooked Christians who apparently knew very little about the Ten Commandments, the four Gospels, and many letters of the Apostle Paul. Bernie calls politics as entertainment, a TV approach exploited by Donald Trump. During the 2016 campaign, the one-time Bernie Sanders was interviewed by prominent TV pundit. At the end of the show, this pundit said, "Oh, by the way, Hillary Clinton, such and such, what is your comment?" Bernie was left speechless by the TV pundit, who left him only 10 seconds to reply. Bernie quotes Eric Berlett, a blog writer for Media Matters for America, which is a watchdog organization. Eric Berlett reported that 1. Trump has received more network coverage than all of the Democratic candidates combined. 2. Trump has amounted for 27% of all campaign coverage this year. Bernie's favorite hosts were Chris Cuomo, Anderson Cooper, Rachel Maddow, Chris Hayes, Brett Baier, and Chris Matthews, all on cable TV. Bernie quotes Rupert Murdoch, the right-wing billionaire, who was one of the most powerful people on the planet.
Can I pause you there for a station break?
Sure.
Okay.
I talk like a machine, don't I?
We're about ready for a station break, though.
Yeah, well, this is my colleague, Dave DeWitt, who's a journalist from Athens News, and I am Robert Whaley, historian. We are both basically on the same side for left-wing liberal Democrats, and we all think that Bernie Trump will be a disaster. We have a few minor disagreements here and there. Would you like to say anything further about this?
Well, about the subject that you're addressing now, the corporate media, I think that Bernie Sanders' points are well taken with regard to the coverage that they afforded Donald Trump. He didn't have to spend money like a traditional candidate because his candidacy and his campaign was so garish that all of the media was caught rubbernecking, essentially. They were giving him all sorts of free airwave time, free publicity, basically, because every time that he said something outlandish, and he knew this, all he had to do was say something outlandish, and he would control the news cycle. And when you're dealing with a 24/7 news cycle, a media-minded man like Donald Trump knows that if he can get the attention, then he's got the microphone, and that takes the attention off of all of his opponents. I think the media played into his hands as far as that goes. And I think that when you have a situation like we have in America with networks that literally control the airwaves. They were given the airwaves. They bought the airwaves.
The networks did control in 1945.
They didn't.
When?
They did not, you're saying? Or they did?
Well, let me hear your statement again. The networks, that's only one of the media.
Yeah, and then there's cable, too.
Yeah, there's cable and the newspapers.
And the newspapers.
We had 4 or 5 different groups in the media.
The point that I'd like to make
is
that when candidates have to, basically what I'm saying is that when candidates have to buy time.
That's advertisement.
Right, for political advertisements, whether it's in the newspapers or on the airwaves. Basically, they have to go out and raise a whole bunch of money to do that because it's very expensive to buy this advertising time.
That's right.
If we truly want candidates who can say what they truly think, and they don't have to go out to rich people to raise this money to buy the time to get the people's attention on the airwaves, if we gave them time to make their statements without this infection of money in the process, I think that we'd get more honest candidates. I think that we'd have a more honest dialogue. And I think it would better the American political process. And that's the only point that I want to make.
The point I want to get back to is that Harry Truman did not have any money to buy advertisement. And he won in 1948 in a fluke election by his own hard personal work on the back of a train that went from New York to Los Angeles. And he spoke in every little small town to the farmers and said, "You've never had it better under the New Deal." And the polls, which was money, Gallup had money because he could buy polls. They all predicted Eisenhower was going to win. No, Truman ran against
Dewey.
Dewey was in the bag. But Truman fooled them. People voted for an honest man, which only happened once in that race. And Dewey then was too reserved because he was dependent on advertising. The Gallup poll. Now, Gallup poll had subtle advertisement. He was a Republican, and he claimed his polls were scientific. So Dewey didn't particularly win with, Camel cigarettes or pornographic literature. He didn't win with that. He just won with the polls by George Gallup, which was supposedly scientific. Well, then after Eisenhower, now Eisenhower's the first TV candidate. And that was mass advertisement on television. And the medium began to change the message. And Eisenhower had a public relations man that advertised Breakfast of Champion, Wheaties. And he invented the slogan, 3 minute, I like Ike, you like Ike, everybody likes Ike. That's mass media.
Yeah.
That's propaganda.
It continued to evolve.
And it got worse and worse.
Kennedy, that commercial. And then by 1964, we had Lyndon Johnson using the Daisy commercial, the famous girl picking flowers with nuclear holocaust in the background. And so it progressed rapidly from there. But as I understand it, to this day, you maintain your skepticism about the polls. Yeah,
polls are fixed. You know that, don't you? Polls can be bought. Very simple.
Well, I know that there are certain polling organizations that are funded by one side or another.
Yeah, but let's take Eisenhower's poll by George Gallup. George Gallup tilted the polls in favor of Protestants, in favor of Episcopalians. Eisenhower was a military man in favor of the military. And we needed a military man to save us from communism. Well, who put the anti-communist cliche on the radio? That communism was a bigger threat than fascism. That was all bought for. That was propaganda. And Johnson expands that anti-communism theme.
Right.
And that's how propaganda, and that's how importance of George Orwell. George Orwell exposes the American polling system.
Well, I think that propaganda came out, and share your thoughts on this, because when Truman decided to maintain a permanent military, there had to be a rationale for that. There had to be an enemy that this military was existing for.
They exaggerated
and the threat of communism was the enemy that was the justification for the maintenance of a permanent military.
Right.
And I think that Eisenhower and Truman knew this game. They knew that it was propaganda to some level.
Well, I think that every politician knows that there's propaganda.
Yeah,
every politician knows there's Democratic propaganda and Republican. That's obvious.
I'm talking about the anti-communism propaganda specifically.
Well, anti-communism cut across all of these groups.
The party lines.
Yeah. In other words, people were anti-communist for different reasons. Okay? Communism was considered evil. Communism was a threat to capitalism. So naturally, all businessmen don't like communists. My father didn't like communism. Now, my problem in high school is I didn't have an adequate understanding of the meaning of communism, because the textbook never explains who is Karl Marx, who is Lenin, who is Stalin. It was just cliches.
Right.
See? Now, Roosevelt had his propaganda in World War II.
So they didn't have you read Das Kapital in high school?
Nobody ever heard of that. but you get that in college.
Right.
That's the difference between college and high school. In my high school textbook, they had 3 little lines in Western Civ that went from Egypt to Truman. They showed a picture of Karl Marx with his bushy hair. And they said, Karl Marx was an atheist. Mm-hmm. Well, end of the story. Nobody asked any other questions. They weren't going to discuss Marx. And the professor never said, hey, let's discuss Karl Marx. You learned that at college.
So is that in college? Is that when you actually delved into the philosophy of Marx?
All right. When I got to college, we're talking about 1951, I had a religious awakening, and I had a political awakening, because I learned politics from my father and my mother. And I found dentistry too simple because it's kind of mechanical. Mm-hmm. Once you learn your biochemistry and physiology, it's very easy to repair teeth, and it gets to be a routine profession. So in 1951, I was draft bait for the Korean War. Mm-hmm. And my father had been in World War I, and he hated war and he hated the army. So I didn't want to go in expanded war. So when Truman fired MacArthur, I became a Truman Democrat. Mm-hmm. Okay? And then I asked myself, well, why is Truman kind of confused about Korea? Why is there a war in Korea? And I discovered that Truman doesn't understand the balance of power. Mm-hmm. Well, I understood the balance of power in high school. In high school, I learned World War I was started by 5 great powers: England, France, Russia on one side, Germany and Austria on the other, and the United States was drawn in late in 1917 to bail the British and French on the Western Front.
About 100 years ago this month, really.
Yeah. And then after World War I, which everybody lost, the communists took over in Russia, and that was a brand new ideology. Everyone assumed that communists would never gain grounds. So in 1943, 45, when I was in high school, just beginning, and World War II was coming to an end, the textbook didn't have much to say about communism. Well, as time went on in the 50s, and we had J. Edgar Hoover and Joe McCarthy, they began to expand courses. Communism. Everybody had to be against communism. Mm-hmm. So that's the difference of the propaganda. Yeah, I don't know. We kind of got off on a tangent. Did I really answer your question there?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, good. So anyway,
so we can get back to the corporate media, and the media obviously played a role.
The media
both the anti-communism
can influence elections, and they could downplay and marginalize Bernie Sanders by saying, A, he's a Jew, and there are not many Jews in America, so why do we want a Jew? And the Christians are the dominant voting bloc. And secondly, they say he's a socialist. Well, what's the difference between socialism and communism? That was the great propaganda of J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon. There is no difference. If he walks like a duck and is a duck, he must be a duck. There's no difference between a pinko, a liberal, a socialist, and a communist. And they're all part of the international communist conspiracy. Well, that's simple high school propaganda.
Yeah, it's a very simplistic way of thinking about.
And I don't think Donald Trump has gotten over it.
Oh, I don't think anyone would peg Donald Trump for a student of political philosophy.
Or propaganda.
Or propaganda, for that matter. Although he does have, I would say, fairly astute media instincts as far as getting people's attention.
He knows how to win the next election. That's what he knows.
Cycle.
Yeah, he knows what to win the next election. And he knew
I think he knows how to appeal to people's emotions. And,
that's right.
Or to press buttons that hit people's emotions in certain ways.
That's true. That's true.
Grab attention.
A historian looks for the truth and downplays emotions. And the psychologists And the sociologist and the English professor kind of uses emotions first and later discover history. That's the way of thinking. Yeah, that's the problem here. So I guess what I'm saying is that Bernie Sanders had too much psychology and too much sociology before he campaigned. And he does have a lot of good economics that I agree with, but he hasn't read very much history, really. That's my criticism of this. But anyway, to get to his good chapter here, let's get back here to the conclusion here on the mass media. Let's see, I dropped my... No, I didn't drop important here. Okay, let's get at these statistics here. The News Corporation. Gosh darn it. The News Corporation owns an enormous amount of media throughout the world, including the major newspapers. The News Corporation is the corporation which was owned by Rupert Murdoch. And he owns newspapers on 3 continents: North America, Europe, and Australia. In the United States, Murdoch's major holdings include the Fox Television, Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, the TV Guide, and Barron's, which is a special financial weekly, which only the millionaires buy. Anyway, Bernie received the endorsement of 1 major newspaper, the Seattle Times. On the other hand, Hillary got the endorsement of over 26 newspapers, and 438 among these, 26 newspapers among the 26 were the Boston Globe, the Houston Chronicle, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. In this chapter, Bernie provided the most important of his lists, called Who Owns the Media? The answer is 5 big conglomerates. These conglomerates own the populous TV stations, CBS, NBC, Fox Channel, and CNN. The 5 big corporations are Comcast. In 2011, had revenues of $35.8 billion. The second one was Walt Disney Company. 2011, revenue $40 billion. And then third, I've already mentioned, the News Corporation of Rupert Murdoch had $33.4 billion. And fourth was the Time Warner, had revenue of $29 billion in 2011. And then Viscom has revenues of $14.9 billion. Now, inside each of these big conglomerates are all of these smaller lists of popular newspapers and television and so forth. For example, Comcast owns NBC, USA Today Network, CNBC, MSNBC, CNBC, the Golf Channel, science fiction, Comcast, sports. In other words, your commercial media and your political media are all in one pot, so to speak. The Weather Channel, the History Channel, and others. So these 3 big media conglomerates should not have been called simply the media, but should have been qualified, and that's what I was getting at in one of my little picky points, the TV mass media. I wanted to make that distinction, going back to Truman. So anyway, professional journalists who write for newspapers and magazines are also part of the mass media communication companies. This means that the oligopolies and the conglomerates are continuing to grow bigger. The second chapter at the end now, Bernie Sanders calls the final word, called the conclusion. The Vermont Sanders writes that when he appeared at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia on the 26th of July, 2016, some of the delegates and supporters were disappointed and in tears. Nevertheless, Bernie says, we had come very far, just not far enough. Bernie's campaign raised 4 issues of justice: economic justice, social justice, racial justice, and environmental justice. And Bernie's 5th issue was a negative argument: the fight against the great billionaire class. Bernie writes, in Transforming America is the most important election. Bernie writes, quote, Transforming America is more than just elections. It is the campaign to change American culture. This reviewer seldom uses the sweeping word culture. As a historian, electoral politics is the story of the activities of 4 elites. 1, the political elite. 2, the economic elite. 3, the American Defense Department, called the War Department by all of the presidents from George Washington to Franklin Roosevelt. Because of the American victory in World War II, President Harry Truman opened the new Pentagon building at the end of the war, and Truman created the new Department of Defense. This 4th elite, or let's say there is a 4th elite, which might be called the intellectuals, but I think it should be called a system of moral, ethical, and religious principles. Ethics are derived by studying the 2 civilizations, Christianity and Judaism. These 2 organized religions were tied at the hip at the 1st century. Islam, Hinduism, the Chinese civilization are alien to America's 2 ethical systems. Both Christianity and Judaism, since the 1st century, have evolved into more sophisticated and living civilizations. Pagan cultures have been modified by philosophy and science and an interaction between the 5 or 6 competitive living civilizations. As a historian and a citizen, I was in favor of peace and religious and on religious and philosophical grounds since my high school days in 1944-48. As I taught history at 4 universities, I developed 2 biases. The first against nuclear arms race, which transformed itself into my second bias, which began a religious philosophical conviction, or which became a philosophical and moral position. I became convinced that undeclared presidential wars in Indochina and the Middle East can never bring victory to the United States. There are simply not enough white Christians and white Democrats to occupy the greater Middle East from Morocco to Pakistan. My final conclusion is American electorate must frequently read the American Constitution if America is to continue to be a democracy. Bernie Sanders, if he writes a second copy of his new agenda for the future, should not only add some important historical works, he should add an important essay on the Nuremberg trials, 1945-48, against Nazi Germany. See Christopher Browning, There are 2 different ways of looking at mass murder, published in the New York Review of Books in November 2016. Christopher Browning has written many books on the Nuremberg trials and Hitler's extermination of Jews in World War II. Hitler's final solution was a crude word and a code word for plans to exterminate all of Europe's Jews. Hitler's final solution has been popularly called the Holocaust. Today, the problem with Jewish intellectuals is that they have tendencies to search for collective guilt rather than individual guilt. The problem of guilt has also been clarified by two famous essays by George Orwell, which apparently Senator Sanders, Vermont, shows no evidence of having read. They are Animal Farm, 1946, and 1984, published in 1949. The importance of Orwell for our own times is that he exposes the use of propaganda by all politicians, journalists, popular religious leaders who speak about from megachurches. Another Jewish sociologist who Bernie seems to have read and not read is Max Weber. Max Weber wrote an important essay in 1905 in German. This pioneer work was a reinterpretation of Karl Marx with a new sociology. Weber's work was called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and it was translated into English in 1930. Max Weber is also important for today's discussion of clarifying the differences between a community and a society. A community is a face-to-face organization gathered in small groups. American society consists of over 300 million people. The mass media constantly confuses the differences between the CIA and the Defense Department. These are not cultural groups. These are only two military bureaucracies. A bureaucracy is not a community, still less a culture. The military-industrial complex invented by General Dwight Eisenhower in 1960 has led most subsequent American presidents into unending wars. Rather, it is the rejection of Eisenhower's concept of the military-industrial complex. Both houses of Congress have failed to live up to the Constitution, no duty of protecting the voters in their individual states or congressional districts. President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a balance between the corporations and the politicians and the three branches of government defined by the United States Constitution. Truman and Eisenhower were honest men and performed reasonably well in the White House. Since 1960, subsequent presidents, with one or two exceptions, have been corrupted by money, bad ideas of the Manichaeans. Secular ideology was invented by the French Revolution in 1789 to 1815 during the First French Revolution. A variety of ideologies became inevitable when natural science undermined 6 living civilizations. And that, I guess, is my final word so far. And I guess that is the end of this discussion. Glad you came on this show called Professor. Oxygen of Democracy. And we are a little bit overtime or under time.
A little bit,
yeah. Do you want to say anything further about
Well, I just wanted to ask you about Bernie Sanders' recent polls have shown that he's the most popular politician in America, which I think
Now, whose polls are these?
It was the Washington Post, perhaps?
The Washington Post.
Maybe. I'm not sure. I don't know. Don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
But I've seen that headline recently, and I was wondering what your thoughts are
Well, it's very recent.
On Bernie Sanders' future.
Well, he's running up the hill of Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Donald Trump, yeah, we only got 2 minutes. But anyway, in these 2 minutes, I would like to say that Donald Trump has 70 to 80% of the votes in the Supreme Court, both houses of Congress, state legislatures, and the Democrats are running as outsiders. Our great hope is 240 judges are still Democratic holdovers. Now, whether Trump can gradually erode those over time, that's the $64 billion question.
So we'll be relying on the judicial branch to protect the
I'm relying on
Constitution
the,
for now.
plus the media. There are some good media guys like these Democrats who, like Bernie Sanders, who are speaking out. But we're running from behind, is what we're saying as liberals and historians.
So we've got promises to keep and miles left before we sleep. Eh?
Okay, well, okay. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Professor.
And what will we do next week?
I guess we're about at the 100-day mark, so we can always
wanna talk
about the
about
100
that?
days.
Well, I will let you take the initiative. You can write 10 questions of what you think are important, and then I will respond to them as the historian.
All
I will
right.
say, I believe this, I don't believe that, and we already know that we both are critical of Donald Trump. The problem is to convince the uninformed voter.
We'll see if we can do that. Thank you.
Great.